At exactly 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, inside reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, a routine safety test crossed an invisible line. Power surged beyond control, safety systems failed, and in less than a second, the core exploded with a force comparable to multiple atomic bombs. The reactor lid, weighing over 1,000 tons, was blown into the air. Burning graphite, uranium fuel rods, and radioactive debris were hurled into the night sky. Flames lit up the Ukrainian darkness in unnatural shades of green and orange. This was not a nuclear weapon. There was no mushroom cloud. And yet, the destruction was worse in another way, because this explosion did not end. It continued to burn. The reactor core was now open to the atmosphere, releasing radiation directly into the Soviet Union itself. Firefighters arrived without protective gear, unaware that the glowing debris around them was lethal. In that moment, the Soviet state lost something far more valuable than a reactor. It lost control. As the reactor burned, radiation rose silently into the atmosphere, invisible and unstoppable. Winds carried it beyond borders, beyond maps, beyond ideology. Radioactive particles drifted across Ukraine, Belarus, and deep into Russia. Within days, traces reached Scandinavia, setting off alarms in Sweden, not because the West was watching the USSR, but because the radiation could no longer be hidden. This cloud represented more than environmental danger. It marked the moment the Soviet Union lost narrative control. The system that claimed total mastery over science and industry was exposed by an invisible enemy it could neither see nor admit. Inside the Kremlin, panic grew. The leadership realized this was no localized accident. Radiation meant agriculture contamination, mass evacuation, medical collapse, and long-term economic damage. This drifting cloud carried an unspoken truth. The Soviet economy, already fragile, was about to face a cost it could not calculate and could not escape. Pripyat had been a showcase city. Built for nuclear workers and engineers, it represented Soviet modernity. Clean apartments, schools, parks, and a future promised by atomic power. 36 hours after the explosion, it was emptied in silence. 50,000 people were told they were leaving temporarily. They packed one small bag. Pets were left behind. Toys remained on floors. No one ever returned. Apartment blocks stood frozen in time. Classrooms still held books. The Ferris wheel never carried its first riders. What had been productive, valuable urban infrastructure instantly became a liability. From an economic perspective, Pripyat was not just abandoned, it was written off. Housing stock, utilities, roads, and services vanished from the balance sheet overnight, and Pripyat was only the beginning. Across the exclusion zone, entire towns followed. Every empty building became a reminder. This disaster would generate costs, but never revenue. Years later, Mikhail Gorbachev would reflect on Chernobyl with brutal honesty. He wrote that this single event, more than reforms or political pressure, was the real cause of the Soviet collapse. At the time, Gorbachev was already struggling. The economy was stagnating. Productivity was falling. Technology lagged far behind the West. And yet, the system survived barely through oil exports. Chernobyl shattered his room to maneuver. Suddenly, every reform priority was replaced by emergency spending. Instead of investing in computers, modernization, and efficiency, the state was forced to pour resources into radioactive soil. Behind closed doors, financial ledgers began to fill with numbers that did not add up. No plan accounted for permanent evacuations, lifelong healthcare, poisoned land, and destroyed energy infrastructure. Chernobyl forced the leadership to confront an impossible reality. The Soviet system could survive pressure, but it could not survive unlimited cost. On the surface, the Soviet Union in 1986 appeared indestructible. It commanded the world's largest army. It maintained nuclear parity with the United States. It controlled half of Europe. But beneath the symbols, the economic foundation was cracking. Factories were inefficient. Output was inflated on paper. Innovation lagged decades behind the West. The empire functioned not because it was strong, but because it was subsidized. Central planning hid inefficiencies. Military power masked financial weakness. Chernobyl exposed this contradiction. A system that could mobilize armies could not absorb unlimited civilian cost. The disaster forced the Soviet Union to spend resources without gaining strategic advantage. No territory was gained, no production increased, no legitimacy strengthened. For the first time, the empire faced a threat it could not suppress with tanks or ideology. A financial burden that grew silently, month after month. Timing made everything worse. Just months before Chernobyl, Saudi Arabia flooded global oil markets. Prices collapsed from nearly $30 a barrel to under 10. For the Soviet Union, this was catastrophic. Oil exports provided the hard currency needed to import grain, technology, and consumer goods. Overnight, export revenue was cut in half. The budget began to bleed. Reserves disappeared. Borrowing increased. Then, Chernobyl exploded. Now, instead of earning foreign currency, the USSR was burning it. Every helicopter flight, every evacuation bus, every medical unit consumed fuel and money the state no longer had. Oil had been the lifeline. With prices collapsed and costs exploding, the Soviet economy lost both income and stability simultaneously. This was not mismanagement, it was a mathematical trap. Desperation took to the air. Military helicopters flew directly over the exposed reactor core, dumping sand, boron, and lead into the flames. Each flight shortened the lifespan of the aircraft. Radiation damaged engines, avionics, and metal frames. Helicopters that cost millions became unusable after only a handful of missions. Fuel consumption skyrocketed. Equipment losses mounted. Pilots absorbed lethal doses. This was emergency spending at the most extreme level. No cost-benefit analysis, no efficiency, no optimization. The only goal was to slow the catastrophe. From an accounting perspective, this was pure destruction of capital. Assets were sacrificed with no replacement value. Chernobyl had become an industrial furnace consuming machinery, labor, and money, producing nothing in return. Evacuation created another economic shockwave. Tens of thousands became refugees overnight. They required housing, food, employment, healthcare, and compensation. Entire new cities had to be built. Slavutych alone cost hundreds of millions of rubles. This was not disaster relief for weeks or months, it was permanent resettlement. Every displaced family represented a recurring expense, utilities, pensions, benefits, without corresponding productivity. In a planned economy already stretched thin, these obligations accumulated silently, year after year. Chernobyl turned citizens into dependents, and dependents into permanent line items in a collapsing budget. The exclusion zone was sealed forever. Farms were abandoned, factories shut down, infrastructure decayed behind barbed wire, productive land was erased from the economy, roads, power lines, and irrigation systems were written off. Nature reclaimed villages, but the state still paid the cost. This land had once produced food, jobs, and tax revenue. Now it produced nothing except ongoing monitoring expenses. The Soviet economy lost output without losing obligations. That imbalance proved fatal. Over 600,000 men were mobilized as liquidators, soldiers, miners, engineers, sent into lethal conditions with minimal protection. They were promised higher wages, lifetime health care, early retirement, and housing priority. These promises became law, and laws became liabilities. Chernobyl did not end when the debris was cleared. It followed the liquidators for decades in medical bills, pensions, and compensation claims. This transformed a short-term emergency into a permanent financial drain. The Soviet state had drafted an entire generation into radiation and promised to pay for it forever. The sarcophagus was not just concrete, it was desperation made solid. Millions of tons of steel and cement were poured into sealing the reactor. Cranes, labor crews, logistics, all under extreme conditions. By 1989, direct costs exceeded 18 billion rubles. That equaled an entire year of defense spending, and the structure was never permanent. It would require maintenance, upgrades, and eventually replacement. Costs deferred into the future. Chernobyl ensured the Soviet Union would keep paying long after it stopped existing. With no revenue and no taxes to raise, the state printed money. Rubles flooded the economy without production to support them. Inflation rose, savings evaporated. Trust collapsed. Chernobyl became a financial black hole, absorbing resources, generating nothing. Money lost meaning. The system lost credibility. Radiation poisoned farmland across Belarus and Russia. Milk was dumped, meat destroyed, crops abandoned. Food imports surged, paid for with borrowed Western money. The Soviet Union was now borrowing from its Cold War enemies to feed its population. This was not ideological defeat, it was economic humiliation. Citizens stopped believing, shelves emptied, lines grew longer, hoarding replaced planning. The social contract collapsed, money no longer represented security. Eastern Europe saw weakness. Occupation was expensive. Control required cash. The Berlin Wall fell not to tanks, but to insolvency. The Soviet Union did not end in war. It ended in default, an empire undone by a safety test and a bill it could never pay.